Hello everyone, welcome back to Global Government News. This is the second part of this economic news video, and we're finishing up, we finished up with this article from Bloomberg. Economists cut U.S. growth forecast as firms limit hiring. This one is titled U.S. is Bankrupt and We Don't Even Know. Lawrence Kotlikoff says, let's get real, the U.S. is bankrupt. Neither spending more nor taxing less will help the country pay its bills. Says what it can and must do is radically simplify its tax, healthcare, retirement, and financial systems, each of which is a complete mess. But this is the good news. It means that they can each be redesigned to achieve their legitimate purposes at much lower cost, and in the process revitalize the economy. Last month, the IMF released its annual review of the U.S. economic policy. Its summary contained these bland words about U.S. fiscal policy. Quote, directors welcomed the authorities' commitment to fiscal stabilization, but noted that a larger than budgeted adjustment would be required to stabilize debt to GDP. But delve deeper and you will find that the IMF has effectively pronounced the U.S. bankrupt. Section 6 of the July 2010 Selected Issues paper says, quote, the U.S. fiscal gap associated with today's federal fiscal policy is huge for plausible discount rates. It adds that, quote, closing the fiscal gap requires a permanent annual fiscal adjustment equal to about 14% of the U.S. GDP. And just stick with me here, a lot of percentages and numbers, but they break it down for you in the next paragraph. It says the fiscal gap is the value today, or the present value, of the difference between projected spending, including servicing official debt, and projected revenue in all future years. And it says double our taxes. To put 14% of GDP in perspective, current federal revenues totals 14.9% of GDP. So the IMF is saying that closing the U.S. fiscal gap from this revenue side requires, roughly speaking, an immediate and permanent doubling of our personal income, corporate and federal taxes, as well as the payroll levy set down in the Federal Insurance Contribution Act. It says such a tax hike would leave the U.S. running a surplus equal to 5% of the GDP this year, rather than a 9% deficit. So the IMF is really saying the U.S. needs to run a huge surplus now, and for many years to come, pay for the spending that is scheduled. It is also saying the longer the country waits to make tough fiscal adjustments, the more painful they will be. It says, is the IMF bonkers? No, it has done its homework. So is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, whose long-term budget outlook released in June shows an even larger problem. And I covered that in a recent video, so you might want to go and check that out so we can move on here. But it basically says that based on the CBO's data, they calculate a fiscal gap of $202 trillion, which is more than 15 times the official debt. This gargantuan discrepancy between our, quote, official debt and our actual net indebtedness isn't surprising. It reflects what economists call the labeling problem. Congress has been very careful over the years to label most of its liabilities unofficial to keep them off the books and far in the future. This next Reuters article is titled Analysis, Fast-Fading Recovery Now Looks Even Weaker. It says U.S. consumers will set the course for a gasping economic recovery that is starting to lose two of its strongest sources of support. Economists have long expected that the growth would slow in the second half of this year as government stimulus spending dries up, state and local governments slash outlays, and companies finish restocking lean inventories. What they did not anticipate was the economy would lose most of its momentum before the year was half over. A surprisingly swift slowdown that prompted the Federal Reserve to rethink its economic outlook and announce more steps to prop up the economy. I love how they use those words, to prop up, to give the illusion that there's investment going on, right? To give the illusion that there's people out there that believe that the economy is going to recover. And of course, it was unusual uncertainty. That's the term that the Federal Reserve used. It says the anemic recovery just got even slower, says Jay Bryson, global economist with Wells Fargo in Charlotte, North Carolina. Stock investors reconsidering growth prospects dumped shares on Wednesday, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 250 points by mid-afternoon. Finishing up, it says recent data suggests The second quarter growth rate was far weaker than initially reported, so weak that it might even have slipped back into the negative territory were it not for the federal government spending and inventory building. See, and that's what the quick point I just want to stress is that if we just allow the economy to right itself, because we don't live in a free market, we never have, and I don't think we ever will. I'm not being pessimistic. I just believe that too many people in the high places and the movers and the shakers don't really believe in a true free market, so I don't think that it will ever exist in my lifetime. But they like to act as though we do live in a free free market capitalism and a capitalistic market, but we don't. But they like to blame capitalism and blame free markets somehow for all of the problems. But this is for people who, I'm not saying I'm an economist or I have a degree in economics or I'm into financial planning or any of that. No, I do news commentary. I have a degree in journalism, and that's about it. But what I am starting to understand more about how the economy works, and that it's not, and how it's not a free market. So without being too redundant there, yeah, so when they try to do all these things like prop up the economy, they're just, I would like to say they're preventing the inevitable, which is an economic collapse, but there may not even be a collapse because they'll just keep taking money, stimuluses, and the Federal Reserve will keep manipulating the market and interest rates and the printing of money in order to give the illusion that the economy is okay, while the banks and lending institutions steal trillions upon trillions of dollars from people who aren't even born yet, with money that isn't backed by nothing. So I don't like to see comments like that when it says so weak that it might even have slipped back into the negative territory, were not for the federal government spending and inventory buildup. So they were, it was by threat of martial law, that there was martial law due to the economy collapsing, that basically allowed the legislation for the TARP funds, the bailout, to be passed. So this next one is from the London Telegraph. Bank of England warns UK recovery will be weaker than hoped. Britain faces a weaker economic recovery and higher inflation for longer than previously hoped. The Bank of England forecast today, this is from August 11th, 2010, economic expansion will peak at 3% next year, weaker than the 3.6% the bank was expecting just 3 months ago. Today's inflation report also forecasts that the level of prices will remain above the bank's 2% target for much of next year. And I'm just going to read this paragraph here and move on to the last two articles. This is Mervyn King, the bank's governor, said at a press conference that while, quote, the UK recovery is likely to continue, the overall outlook is weaker than at last forecast in the spring. Sorry, I worded that wrong, but today's forecast reflects the wider threat of simultaneous slowdown in Europe and the U.S., Britain's two biggest trading partners, as well as the austerity measures announced in the coalition government budget. This next one is also from the London Telegraph, and it says, business facing a wave of green taxes, thousands of British businesses will be liable for significant fines and charges under a new government green tax scheme. And they should just call it what it is, a scam, right? It says companies that fail to register their energy use by next month will be hit with fines that could reach £45,000 under the little-known rules. Those that do participate in the Carbon Reduction Commitment (CRC) initiative by declaring their energy use will face charges for every ton of greenhouse gas they produce. These payments are expected to average £38,000 a year for medium-sized firms and could reach $100,000 for larger organizations. Surveys have shown that thousands of businesses are unaware that they are supposed to be taking part, or even that the scheme exists at all. You like that? The imposition of new charges and fines will put the pressure on the firms at a time when economists are warning of a double-dip recession as companies, consumers, and the public sector all cut their spending. So you like that, folks? You like that free market capitalism? God, I love it. Speaking of free market, Wall Street increasingly favors fascist neoconservative Republicans study. And the disinfo continues. Thank you.